Good evening. War is the most searing of human experiences, in which political expediency and hindsight often cloud the reality of the time. War creates its own myths, and nostalgia may blind us to historical fact. In these full programs, we are exploring what some believe are myths of World War II. Did Britain need to fight Hitler to the bitter and bloody end? That's what we examine tonight. This is probably the most contentious question of all in any reassessment of the war. Few would doubt that Hitler was the monster of the 20th century, and it was above all the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of millions of Jews, that placed the Nazis at the very pinnacle of evil. The idea of pursuing any other policy than war against such a barbaric regime is, for most people, unthinkable. But in the early years of the war, in 1940 and at the start of 1941, things were not as clear-cut. The Holocaust, with its unique horror, is still to come. In fact, the Nazis did not decide on the extermination policy of the Holocaust until after the time period on which we concentrate tonight. But what the British did know in 1940 and early 41 was that they stood alone against an array of dictators. Most brutal is Joseph Stalin, who's responsible for the deaths of nearly 14 million of his people. He's just forged a non-aggression pact with the Germans, although British intelligence knows the Nazis plan to attack Russia. Hitler has already overrun Eastern Europe and is terrorizing Poland. He's defeated France and installed a pro-Nazi government there under Marshal Pétain. And Italy is run by Mussolini, the man who used poison gas in his territorial conquest in Africa. Thus isolated, Britain desperately needs an ally. But so far, America has only offered comforting words and vague promises of economic help. To some at the time, Germany is our obvious ally. With us is Alan Clarke, the historian and former minister, who argues that Britain's national interest could have been better served by reaching a compromise peace with Hitler instead of holding out to the end. He'll be defending his case before a panel of war veterans and international historians. Mr. Clarke's view strikes at the heart of our most cherished belief about the war and about ourselves, and no doubt many who lived through the period will find his thesis deeply offensive. It is, however, rooted in historical fact. But perhaps on this, the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, the time is right to air and challenge alternative views. This is Alan Clarke's case.
British troops advancing through Germany in the final weeks of the world's most bitter conflict, a war that claimed over 50 million lives. Two out of every 3 deaths were civilians, or non-combatants, as they used to be called. By the time Germany surrendered to us, British deaths were almost 400,000. That memory offers comfort as well as pain, the perspective of morality, victory, and self-sacrifice in standing up to Germany. Even today, most people have been conditioned to think that fighting to the bitter end was unquestionably the right thing. But is this true? Whether or not Britain should have fought the Nazis is not what we need to examine. My argument is that continuing the war beyond a certain point prolonged the bloodshed and left Britain irreparably damaged. There was an alternative. An early compromise peace with Germany could have been secured, and there were several occasions when we could have had it. Hitler broadcast on the 19th of July 1940 a speech that directly offered peace. He went as far as any head of state could go without risking personal humiliation.
In dieser Stunde fühle ich mich verpflichtet, vor meinem Gewissen noch einmal einen Appell an die Vernunft auch in England zu richten. Ich glaube, dies tun zu können, weil ich ja nicht als besiegt um etwas bitte, sondern als Siegen nur für die Vernunft spreche. Ich sehe keinen Grund, der zur Fortführung dieses Kampfes zwingen könnte. Ich bedauere die Opfer, die er fordern wird. Auch meinem eigenen Volk möchte ich sie ersparen.
Hitler's offer was not just a public relations exercise. He knew that London had already sought to negotiate peace terms with him. In Britain, in the summer of 1940, the official announcements were all defiance.
We shall go on to the end. We shall not fail. We shall fight on the seas and on the ocean. We shall fight in the air. We shall fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and on the hills, as we fought in blazing Dunkirk. We shall never surrender.
This is Britain's war myth. The real story is different. As early as the 23rd of May 1940, the cabinet had discussed the possibility of approaching Hitler. The following month, Foreign Office Minister Rab Butler conducted one-to-one talks with the ambassador of neutral Sweden, Björn Pritz.
Butler wanted to explain to Pritz that Britain would officially continue the war, but that if some other solution that was to the advantage of Britain came up, they would consider it. Of course, this was apparently such an important meeting that it was matter of discussion amongst the younger members of the staff.
Tort Hagen is one of the last living witnesses to this encounter. During the war, he was a young diplomat ciphering telegrams in the Swedish embassy. The ambassador sent a coded message about the meeting, and the Swedes have released the text. All the British documents, however, are still closed, long after the statutory 30-year period.
According to the telegram, it was a question of whether there was any chances of Britain getting out of the war and under what circumstances. Mr. Butler seemed to have indicated that if there was a chance of getting a settlement that was to Britain's advantage, one should not hesitate to take that.
Pritz's telegram, which the Swedes confirm is accurate, revealed that Butler said British policy would reject bravado. Butler said common sense would prevail, and he would keep diehards out of the way of talks. Secretary of State Halifax endorsed this position. He would take over as Prime Minister, and Churchill would be displaced. Conservative MPs were ready for it. Next day, the cabinet met without Churchill. In his diary, the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office noted, "Still no word from the Germans." The idea of these contacts with Nazi Germany may seem shocking now, but the attitude they revealed is entirely consistent with a responsible foreign policy. When diplomats talk about common sense, I can tell you it's a kind of shorthand for their intention to put the national interest first. Of course, the Nazis were a disagreeable and repressive regime. This made them a distasteful partner for any negotiations. But that is not a primary factor in determining a foreign policy. There are disagreeable nations today, and we don't make war on them. China, Libya, everyone has their own list. The real question to address is how and when could Britain have negotiated for the best terms? And about that, there were different opinions, even in the highest reaches of government. In summer 1940, Churchill had only just come to power, and he blocked all discussions. This still puzzles the Germans.
It was Churchill who was approached with the peace initiatives, either directly or indirectly. But it was also Churchill who, as it were, rejected them and refused to act on them. The interesting question is whether not just Hitler, but also Churchill could be named as, or rather accused of, being the one who hindered the peace process.
What we must remember is Churchill's personal stake in continuing the fighting. Although a Tory for the whole of the previous decade, he had opposed appeasement. When it came, war delivered to him supreme office. He knew that an early settlement would have ended his career. In that first year of 1940, Britain's interest was well served by this opposition to talks. With Europe disappearing under the German onslaught, the price of peace would have been intolerably high. Negotiations would simply have been a liquidator's audit. But there was that other factor in his calculations. To survive personally as Prime Minister, Churchill had to exclude any discussion of peace at any time. This was a tragedy for Britain, because that winter, things were about to change. By early 1941, we had reached a position of much greater strength. The Battle of Britain had been won. The threat of invasion was no longer realistic. The Italians had been defeated in North Africa, and Britain knew from cracking Germany's secret codes that Hitler wanted to commit all his forces to an imminent attack on Russia. It was the time to talk about peace, and the Germans knew it.
In 1941, once Hitler had completed his plans for Barbarossa, that is, the attack on the Soviet Union, it would have been to his advantage to have come to an agreement with Britain first, before the attack took place.
Much later in the war, Hitler said to his deputy, Martin Bormann,
"Of course the British should have made peace in the spring of 1941. They had proved their valor in the skies the previous summer. Now each of us had triumphed over Latin power. It was no longer the European, but the global balance of power which mattered. Pitt would have seen this. Churchill could not."
Although Germany was now ready for peace, Churchill was not. He was riding on a crest of popularity. With such public support for his conduct of the war, there was no political pressure for peace. So now Churchill extended the fighting by ordering the forces to attack in Greece. This premature return to Europe diverted the Desert Army from victory to disaster. After nearly 50,000 of our men had been killed or captured, the survivors were evacuated back to Egypt. But the real tragedy was that Churchill had passed up Britain's last chance for a good settlement with Germany. With the knowledge of the Holocaust, it seems inconceivable to talk about negotiations with the regime of the death camps. But in early 1941, these horrific events had not happened, so the knowledge of them could not have been part of our thinking. In any case, when much later we did learn about the extermination camps, this didn't alter how we fought the war. Indeed, our own interest had allied us with another dictator, Stalin, with his own genocidal program. Political arrangements are seldom about morality. Britain also paid for continuing the war beyond 1941. Up to 500,000 British and Commonwealth lives were the price. But Britain never talked of peace terms with Germany until we had struggled through a devastated continent all the way from Normandy. Only then did Europe's trail of death end in the final peace conference at Potsdam. And in terms of the European map, all that had happened was the substitution of one form of oppression for another.
Here in this very room, the decisive last conference of the war took place, the so-called Potsdam Conference. Hitler always argued that Britain would be better off as a junior partner to Germany than in the position in which she was eventually to find herself after 1945. Next to Germany, he thought Britain would lose most at the end of the war. And in fact, America and Russia became the heirs of Great Britain. That is, the empire was carved up, taken apart, and it was Britain who suffered the most from this dismantling process. Hitler regularly warned that it would happen, and he always said, "If you cooperate with us, you can avoid all that."
Prolonging the war after 1941 greatly worsened Britain's condition. As well as the hundreds of thousands of dead, 5 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Our industrial base was distorted by war, and peacetime productive capacity collapsed. Only by giving away our gold and all our overseas assets to America could we pay for the food and materials we needed for the war. If Churchill had been ready for peace in 1941, what would it have looked like? I believe that a peace deal would have held, if only because it was in both Britain's and Germany's interest that it should. For Britain, the biggest bonus would have been in the Far East. The British fleet could have left the Atlantic and gone east to deter the Japanese. With our ships and the Americans in the Pacific, the Japanese would never have contemplated attacking British colonies. In the Far East and elsewhere, Britain's empire would have survived. In the Middle East, we would have had complete dominion, giving us control of all that region's oil. Certainly, German withdrawal from Western Europe would have been a condition. This would have suited them. They wanted to attack Russia. Europe would then have been tacitly divided between British and German influence. The two peoples would have had to tolerate each other in mutual respect. Removed from the conflict, Britain would have suffered far less destruction. Industry would have reverted quickly to its peacetime footing. New directions in education and welfare would have been left with greater resources. It is my opinion that Britain could have served her interests and possibly those of the world by taking that opportunity for peace in 1941. If there is a moral dimension to this, it lies in the question: how much death is needed before compromise becomes the more attractive option?
That is Mr. Clarke's thesis. Before we discuss the detail of it, let's have a quick reaction from some of our panel. General Sir Anthony Farrar-Hockley.
Well, it's an argument which lacks all credibility to me, to give one of a number of reasons. The idea that Hitler was to be trusted to go forward on the lines that have been suggested is simply absurd. The last thing you wanted to do was find Hitler shaking you by the hand and assuring you that he had no designs on you. You might have known that you were about to be really done over.
That's something that we'll return to in a few minutes' time. Dr. John Charmley.
I think it's a valuable contribution to re-examining a vital period of our history. And I think it can do nothing but good in terms of stimulating debate about a topic that for too long has taken on the status of a sacrosanct national myth.
But why do we have to re-examine it?
Because that's what historians are for.
But we know what the history is, don't we?
No, we don't. We never know what the history is. The wonderful thing about history is that the argument never ends. And the valuable thing about Alan's programme is that it starts up, or at least it helps to continue, an argument that is long overdue.
Mrs. V. Robinson, during the war, you were manning Ack guns against the Luftwaffe.
The firing instrument for Ack guns, yes. I think that it's incredible to me, and a lot at my age, I think, that educated, intelligent people could even think that Germany, as it was then in Nazi Germany, how could they trust him to do whatever he promised? I mean, those talks would be going on yet if they'd started talks, peace talks. How on earth? Plus the fact that the British public would be against it after 2 years of war.
You hear what Mrs. Robinson says, Mr. Clarke.
Yes.
And no doubt she speaks for many people watching this programme. How can you contemplate trying to do deals with the monster of the 20th century?
Well, the question of whether you can trust another diplomat or another country is a question you should never ask yourself, because trust does not come into international relations. The question that you ask is, what are the relative balance of interests between the two negotiating parties? Once you start talking about trust, you delude yourself. You couldn't trust Stalin any more than you could trust Hitler. But the balance of interest and the balance of terror, if you like, and the balance of power, all contrived to make a web that would tie down the negotiating countries into particular positions. I wouldn't suggest for one moment you could trust Hitler as far as you could throw him. That's absolutely right.
So if we're talking about trust, I still am. The British public would not have wouldn't have had that. So if this compromise, this meeting had taken place before the war, you can say that you couldn't trust them, yes, and it could have gone on for months. But we were actually in war at that time.
Yes, it made it much more difficult. I quite agree with you. I'm not sure. I was only a child at that time, so I can't recall. I'm not in a position to really assess whether public opinion was as strong as you yourself recollect. And certainly the peace in 1941, which was the best moment, would have been in the aftermath of the Blitz, and the feeling was a very high level. I fully accept that. But I must emphasize, Peter, that trust doesn't come into this, of course. Anyone who introduces the concept of trust as a currency at all in international relations is going to make a fool of himself.
Yeah, but you're dodging an issue here. There's the question of, in terms of trust, is this man with whom I am making an agreement likely to carry it through? You can call it whatever you like. In the case of Hitler, the answer was no.
What do you assess? What, he could attack Russia?
Well, you know, it's a difficult film to watch because there seem to me so many misleading and tendentious sections in it that one would require to make a very long list and comment on them one by one. His first comment is dismissing quite a lot of his own film as irrelevant. That is to say, having explained that you should do a deal with Hitler, you say, do not, that it would have been a very bad idea to do it in 1940.
Yes,
so that because the balance of power was wrong.
Yes,
and so it would be
right.
what you had quite a nice phrase, I thought, it would be going into liquidation.
Yes.
So you're concentrating entirely on 1941. Now, your Professor Michalka appeared on the scene and very helpfully explained that Hitler thought it would be an excellent idea to have the United Kingdom and preferably the British Empire as a junior partner of the Third Reich. Well, I personally would prefer, and I think most of the British people took for granted this preference. It was hardly even discussed. They would prefer to be dependent on the United States, rather to be junior partners of the United States, rather than to be junior partners of Hitler.
Sorry, Dr. Pye, I'm sorry to interrupt you because we will pursue this in more detail in a few minutes' time. I just wanted to go back to 1940 to consider what indeed is the historical basis for Mr. Clarke's thesis. And if I can paint the picture of the 26th of May 1940, Churchill has only been Prime Minister for just over 2 weeks. It is the day that the order has gone out that the British Expeditionary Force should withdraw from Dunkirk. It is literally our blackest hour. The cabinet documents, the War Cabinet's minutes that are published for that time show what the cabinet is discussing. And the cabinet is discussing peace. Dr. Martin, Professor Martin, you were one of the first historians to really analyze what these hitherto secret cabinet papers said. What did they tell you about Winston Churchill and his cabinet at that time?
It's a little bit difficult for a German to speak about those British or English.
You're speaking as a historian, Professor.
Yes, I'm speaking as a historian, but I don't want to offend anybody. And I think the whole story is much more complicated than could be shown in a film, for example. Of course, the British cabinet was discussing peace at this time. This is a historical fact. We have this evidence in the cabinet papers. And Churchill...
You must put in some footnotes, as I'm sure you'll realize.
And they had a discussion not just for 30 minutes on the peace issue, but for 2 or 3 days. It was going on, and we had a fraction of Halifax and the so-called the Pisas on the one side, and the diehards, Churchill, on the other side. And then they found a kind of compromise, and this was actually Chamberlain who found it, that he, and this is recorded in the cabinet papers, that they should take into account the terms if they wouldn't violate national interests and so on. I can't quote this.
I have the cabinet minutes here,
So
and what is interesting when one reads them is that the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, said that he did not raise any objection to the Foreign Secretary's suggestion, Lord Halifax, that an approach be made to Mussolini with regard to intervening with Adolf Hitler. The suggestion being that we should make concessions like Malta, Gibraltar and some African colonies to Mussolini for the price of his favourable intervention. It is surprising to read Churchill agreeing to that kind of approach. That is not the version of history that most of us have inherited. Is that not right, Dr. Chalmers?
Well, Churchill, of course, Churchill never tells lies, I think. Churchill commits what he would have called terminological inexactitudes. He says in his memoirs that history will record proudly that nowhere during this time did the idea of surrender or a treaty with Germany appear on the cabinet agenda.
The supreme question.
He's absolutely right. It doesn't appear in the cabinet agenda, doesn't mean the cabinet didn't discuss it. And that's just one of the ways in which I think a version of this period has been presented. It's sort of airbrushed history.
Now, we must put this in perspective. I mean, you know the facts perfectly well. This discussion, and so must you since you have them in front of you, this discussion arises as a result of a démarche, a request from the French to assist in preventing a declaration of war, an attack by Mussolini on France. In other words, the cabinet is principally worried about how to help the French.
Dr. Martin, how did British historians react to your conclusions having read the documents?
You see, when I edited my book in 1974 on peace initiatives and power politics in World War II, it was favorably received in Germany, more or less, but here in Britain and in America it was totally neglected up to the 1990s. The first quotation of my book I found in a British publication of 1990. That's not only a matter or question of language, since British historians sometimes have difficulties in reading German, but this topic here was so taboo, even with very serious historians whom I have known personally, so that really this was the myth of an entire nation, of the historians down to common people.
Why taboo?
The myth, maybe, I won't decide on it. This was necessary for the fighting spirit in the war, for propaganda reasons, and that's what they told you who have lived through the war. We will fight to the end, we will never talk about peace, and so on. But the responsible government, every responsible government, has to do that.
Can I just ask you a question about the famous Fritz telegram that Mr. Clarke refers to? Is it conceivable that the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, did not know of Mr. Butler's conversation with the Swedish ambassador?
Yes.
It's entirely conceivable that Churchill didn't know.
Now, look, you know perfectly well that Fritz and Butler met each other accidentally wandering in the park.
It's well.
So they said.
Can we again and again that dodge of Butler? I meet people accidentally. He met them accidentally in Geneva, he met them accidentally in the park, he met them accidentally. This formula was trotted out so many times.
I think the question here is whether we have a myth here in Britain that there had been never any talks, or whether we have to look at historical facts. There is this historical fact that this was a genuine, I would say, genuine British peace failure with Churchill's consent.
But we did not talk about peace. This is the whole point. No. Churchill's government did not. He put out one feeler. That's all. There was never a question of coming face to face, say in a neutral country, on negotiations.
Dr. Kundratov, who is a former general in the KGB, were your antecedents in the KGB at the time aware of the moves that were made for peace within the British cabinet and the German government too?
By two channels. By the channel of the embassy, and our embassy was headed by Ambassador Maisky, and our Secret Service was reporting to Moscow that the influential group of politicians in Great Britain is in favor of concluding a peace treaty with Germany. And naturally, this information was faithfully reported to Stalin and the leaders of the government. And certainly we were very much worried by this information.
What?
Unimaginative.
But we're not getting anywhere. The fact of the matter is that Churchill was determined that we were not going to surrender. He was able to carry people with him, including the opposition, the former opposition members of the cabinet. And we went on fighting. So the 1940 situation is this. Enough members of the cabinet of all political persuasions were with Churchill.
Thank God they were, because it would have been a disaster in 1940.
It would indeed.
But it was totally different a year later.
So let us get on from 1940 to the main issue here about 1941.
Let us do that, Sir Anthony. And let me put it to Mr. Clarke. You believe that in 1941 the time was right to reach an agreement with Hitler. But in 1941, the appeasers had gone. Chamberlain had died. Lord Halifax had been exiled to Washington. Rab Butler had been exiled to another government ministry. In other words, the peace party, the appeasers, simply weren't there. So your thesis in 1941 is political fantasy, isn't it?
It's impractical.
The people were not there.
But historians also have to consider whether an ideal was desirable or attainable. And I have no doubt at all that if we had made peace in 1941, our situation would have been totally different, and we would have been immeasurably stronger, richer, and more people would have been alive.
Well, no,
can I just,
I can't
can I just
that.
ask, let us say that a peace agreement was signed in 1941. So Anthony, what sort of agreement do you think that would have been?
Well, the first thing, Mr. Clarke's point, that one of the conditions on our part would have been that Hitler would have withdrawn from Western Europe. And he just said, righto, Mr. Churchill, I agree with that. I find that absolutely incredible. The second is, what would our relationships have been post-war with those people in Europe, to whom we were the last beacon of hope? Thirdly, how would we have afforded to have kept up the armed forces of Britain, which would have been necessary if we'd come to terms with Hitler, knowing how treacherous he was? The questions go on and on. These hypotheses are thrown at us as if they are a fact. They're not only not a fact, they're extremely unlikely.
Mr. Clarke, if Churchill, by some miracle, had decided to sue for peace in 1941, could he have sold it to the British public, given the kind of emotions that Mrs. Robinson felt at the time and still feels today?
Well, it could have been portrayed as a victory. I don't agree with General Farrar.
How
I think the Germans have been very
victory?
ready to withdraw from Western Europe, from France, that is. They had a Vichy government installed in France. It was effectively a puppet. The only problem, and essential to our interests, would have been to make them get out of Norway because of the dominion that offered over the Atlantic, and obviously in Denmark.
And the Low Countries?
But the question, you posed another question, which is quite an interesting one, when you said, exactly, in Poland, not in Poland. But General Farrar said, well, what about our relations with those people to whom we've been a beacon of hope? Well, whether being a beacon of hope or not is arguable. I mean, most of the majority of the French people much preferred Marshal Pétain to General de Gaulle. But I would say our relations would have been no different than they subsequently were with the whole of Eastern Europe, for which originally we went to war for Poland, and when the war was over, the whole of Eastern Europe, Poland and everywhere else, was completely under communist domination.
Of course, the British can make an agreement with Hitler. There's no problem, of course. The question is what terms and what happens next.
That's why 1941 is a good date to do it.
Can I ask you, Dr. Chalmley, if Churchill had decided to make a deal with Hitler, could he have sold it to the British public?
Well, during the Second World War, the British government actually managed, in the short space of 6 months, to go from selling Russia as the nasty people who were attacking the gallant little Finns to our great heroes and playing the Internazionale on the news.
So what would Churchill have said?
He'd have done exactly what he did in that instance. The Russians went in propaganda from being... Well, remember how tight the government control over what the British people knew and were allowed to know was. If they managed to change Stalin from a blood-stained monster to good old Uncle Joe in 6 months, they could have done a similar job on
No, they didn't. They didn't. That wasn't the attitude in the country at all. You see, one of the problems in your looking at this in a calm and dispassionate way, making hypotheses about this or that in a cool way as between states roughly equal, is that an enormous, you are unaware of and have not lived through, the enormous mood swing that took place in Britain.
Sorry, Mrs. Robinson, can I just ask you, if Churchill had turned round in 1941 and addressed the nation on the radio and said, we are going to reach an agreement with Hitler, what would you have thought?
That we had been betrayed.
By Churchill?
If Churchill said it, yes. Because he was a hero. He came at the right time, really. We needed a leader at the time, a very, very bad time. We needed somebody with all that verve. We needed that. But you're into the war 2 years, 2 or 3 years, you're talking about 1941. Everybody in Britain was affected by the war. They would have, they would have been, there would have been a lot of trouble.
Wouldn't have bought it?
No, not the way they bought, let us fight on the beaches, not that way. I mean, he did the right, he said the right thing.
I think they'd have bought it the way they bought Munich.
Let us finally just examine the question of morality. Mr. Clarke is of the view that nations are governed by their own self-interest, not by any moral principles. Mr. Clarke, you would have been in favour of reaching an accommodation with Hitler. Does that mean that you would have then done business with the regime?
Well, of course you do business with disagreeable regimes. That should never be, moral objections shouldn't be a bar to that. But
even with this particular regime?
Yeah, of course. And what difference is it from the communist regime in Russia? None. The point is, but I must disassociate myself from any argument that we should trust Hitler or that we could do a deal with Hitler. These are real fantasies, and by then we should have realized it was impossible. All you can do is come to an arrangement, and treaties are little more than memoranda that set out the joint interests of the participants, and if our estimation of the German interest and the British interest did not coincide, then we couldn't do it. If they did, trust doesn't come into this. You look at what the German interest is and what their plans are. We knew they were going to attack Russia, and you have to estimate whether they are likely to stick to it or not. You don't introduce the concept of a deal or trust. If you do that, you get your throat cut, of course.
But surely it's not...
Mrs. Robinson.
Surely, I mean, it's a hell of a big risk if you can't trust anybody. I know there's a lot of skullduggery goes on in business and everywhere else, but this is countries and nations. Surely that's an odd attitude, I think, from you.
I know, it's the only attitude that's going to keep you safe. You must never, once you start...
safe is an opposite.
Playing with words.
Did you see, Sir Anthony, because you were a foot soldier in the war, did you see what you were doing as part of a moral crusade against tyranny?
Oh, yes. I think one has to recognise that there was a solidarity in the armed forces and between the armed forces and the civilians. It was one of those phases of life where British people spoke to one another in railway trains and helped one another along, which incidentally stopped the day war ended, VJ Day.
Yes.
It absolutely fell away. Yes. And there was a feeling of solidarity and that we were going to pull through, God knows, through an invasion to start with, and when that receded, we were going to somehow pull through on our own. We knew the difficulties at sea, though not, thank God, all the difficulties. There was a feeling that we were going to go on no matter what it cost us. And I don't believe that the British public would have accepted, however it was manipulated, a peace in 1941. They'd have been bewildered and fallen apart. And bear this in mind, that the French people fell apart because they did not believe in the war getting anywhere. The British people were beginning to fall apart a bit under Chamberlain. But when Churchill came, for whatever motives you like to ascribe to him, and I personally don't go along with the rather venal motives that have been suggested, the fact is he held us together, and we saw not simply that he was a good leader, but that he was speaking for us.
I think that Mr. Clarke would probably, I can't speak for Mr. Clarke, but you would agree with Sir Anthony's analysis,
yes,
that people were driven in that way. What you're saying is that it was wrong.
No, I agree with this analysis, and there is no question that Churchill we owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude as a nation state for what he did in 1940. Because in 1940, if we'd made peace then, we would have been wiped out. All I am trying to argue is that you cannot just, for some abstract ideal, commit yourself indefinitely to another 4 years of conflict and not take account of the various moments, 1941 being the most important, when we could have done a deal which would have left us very much richer and left many more people alive. And the only argument that is being put against that is that we couldn't trust the Germans.
But you've just used the word deal, the word that you said you wouldn't use, Mr. Clarke.
But nobody is talking about trusting. There is a difference between a deal and trusting. The point is this, and let us underline it. Hitler's aim was to attack Russia. He attacked Russia. We were still in the war. Hitler regarded us as such an irrelevance that he went on with what we've been told was his main aim. The point is this, it's not trusting Hitler, but it's saying, was Hitler going to attack Russia? Yes. Then we have to say to ourselves, was there anything that Britain and America did between Barbarossa and Stalingrad that made all the difference for Russia between defeat and victory? The answer is no. The Russians won World War II in Europe.
Yeah, no, the answer is this. The real question is this. What happened after he had beaten the Russians and had got his Lebensraum, etc., etc.? Are we to suppose that he was going to leave Britain?
Why do you think he'd have beaten the Russians? Every side is they would have.
In considering these things, think about what people thought at the time in order to make sense of it. Now, you know perfectly well that it was assumed in Britain and the United States that the Soviet Union would be destroyed and defeated in a matter of weeks. In other words, the question that faces the British is it a good idea to give Hitler a free hand in the East, assuming, which everyone does at the time, that Hitler will then secure control of whatever resources he's interested in Eastern Europe. Now, what happens then? Yes. At that point, and I agree that national interest must be pursued, and the interest Britain is pursuing is national independence. Now, Germany, a Third Reich, in control of the resources of the Soviet Union, is not a country against which British independence can be preserved without an impossible effort and without a ruinous degree of protracted mobilization.
That's perfectly true.
And furthermore, could not be done without American assistance. Now, if the British abruptly cut out of the war, the United States is no longer going to make the calculation that Britain is worth keeping in the war. Obviously, it no longer makes sense.
Can I put it?
Sorry, on a theme by Winston Churchill. It's far more fantastic. What really happened in the war? Yours is a sort of big fan. What really happened was that Russia was attacked.
Something. I'm saying what was expected at the time.
But your argument actually supports Alan's, because if you think the Soviets are going to collapse, get terms and get out before they do.
Can I finally put it to Mr. Clarke, given what you have heard many of our panel say, is that the real myth is yours, that the myth is that although there was some historical basis for your thesis, in practical political terms at the time, it was nonsense. That's the myth.
Well, in practical political terms, it's extremely hard to assess how realistic it was, because many people had an interest in making it impossible. But it is still valid to make an assessment of this kind, because you can see that the cool application of a measured standard of national interest can actually often lead you to policies which are quite different from those that are guided by emotion, by short-term political considerations, by a misreading of history, and by personal interest rather than national interest. And I think all of those elements were present and deflected us from a course which a totally objective analysis indicates is probably the right one.
Mr. Clarke, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all our panel for taking part in this controversial discussion. Clearly, after half a century, the controversy rages on. Good night.